If you've ever driven through central Kentucky, you know the landscape changes. Rolling green hills stretch towards the horizon. White fences wrap around horse farms. Historic stone buildings line winding country roads. The scent of aging bourbon drifts from rick houses scattered across the countryside. And tucked among those hills is Bardstown, a town of just over 13,000 people. Small enough that you recognize familiar faces at the grocery store, large enough to welcome visitors from around the world. For generations, people have called Bardstown one of America's most beautiful small towns. Its downtown looks like something pulled from another century. Brick sidewalks, historic churches, family-owned restaurants, locally owned shops. On warm summer evenings, families stroll Court Square. Children chase one another across the lawn. Neighbors stop to catch up outside local businesses. Tourists arrive hoping to experience Kentucky bourbon country. It's peaceful, comfortable, the kind of place where people imagine raising kids, where police officers know the families they protect, where Friday night football still matters, where local festivals fill the streets with music, food, and laughter. Every September, thousands gather for the Kentucky Bourbon Festival. The town comes alive. Distilleries welcome visitors from around the globe. Parades fill downtown, music echoes through the streets. For most communities, being called the Bourbon Capital of the world would define its identity. For Bardstown, that identity would eventually be overshadowed, not by one tragedy, but by several. Today, when many Americans hear the name Bardstown, they don't think about bourbon. They think about unanswered questions. Disappearances. An ambush. Families waiting for justice. And a town that slowly began wondering if someone among them knew more than they were saying. Because over just a few short years, Bardstown became the center of one of America's most unsettling collections of unsolved crimes. And it all began on a quiet spring morning. Before Bardstown became known for a string of unsolved mysteries, it knew Jason Ellis as something much simpler. He was a husband, a father, a son, a friend. And to the people of Nelson County, he was the kind of police officer you wanted answering the call. Friends described him as steady, easygoing, someone who didn't seek attention. He simply wanted to serve his community. Law enforcement wasn't just a job to Jason, it was a commitment. He joined the Bardstown Police Department and spent years earning the trust of the people he served. In a town the size of Bardstown, policing looked different than it does in a major city. Officers didn't just know street names, they knew the people who lived there. They remembered children's names. They chatted with business owners downtown. They responded to the same families year after year. It wasn't uncommon for Jason to stop and talk with residents who recognized him from previous calls. He wasn't just enforcing the law, he was part of the community. Outside the badge, Jason's world revolved around his family. He and his wife Amy were raising 2 young children. Like so many parents, they were busy balancing work, school events, family dinners, and the ordinary routines that make up everyday life. Those who knew Jason often described him as calm under pressure, the kind of person who rarely let stress show. Police work could be unpredictable, but when his shift ended, he was simply dad. And on the night of May 24th, 2013, that's exactly who he was trying to get home to be. Jason had been working his shift just like any other day. Being a police officer meant long hours. When Jason's shift ended just after midnight, he climbed into his police cruiser and began the familiar drive home. It was a route he'd driven countless times. The roads were quiet. Traffic was light. Most of Bardstown was asleep. Just a few miles separated him from his family. As Jason traveled along the Bluegrass Parkway, he encountered something unusual. A large pile of freshly cut tree limbs had been deliberately placed across the roadway. It completely blocked his lane. For any driver, there would have been only one choice: stop. Investigators believe that was exactly the point. Jason parked his cruiser and stepped outside. He had no way of knowing someone was waiting. As he began moving the branches from the road, a shotgun blast shattered the silence. Jason Ellis was struck and collapsed beside the roadway. The shooter disappeared into the darkness. By the time help arrived, the husband, the father, the police officer was gone. He was only 33 years old. Almost immediately, investigators recognized something deeply unsettling. This wasn't a random act of violence. Whoever placed those branches knew exactly how police officers respond to road hazards. They understood that an officer wouldn't simply drive around them. He would stop. He would get out. He would clear the roadway to protect other drivers. The killer appeared to have anticipated every one of those decisions. Investigators believed Jason had been lured into an ambush. The attack suggested planning, patience, and knowledge of police procedure. That realization changed the investigation from the very beginning. This wasn't just a homicide. Someone had intentionally targeted a law enforcement officer. Within hours, the Kentucky State Police assumed the lead investigation. Bluegrass Parkway became an active crime scene stretching hundreds of yards. Investigators searched the surrounding woods, collected evidence, photographed tire tracks, examined the branches that had blocked the road. Every detail mattered. Detectives interviewed Jason's coworkers, friends, family members, anyone who might have known of threats against him. They examined recent arrests, traffic stops, past investigations. Could Jason have arrested the wrong person? Interrupted a criminal enterprise? Was this retaliation? Or had the killer selected him simply because he was the first officer expected to stop? Months passed, then years, hundreds of interviews, thousands of investigative hours. Multiple rewards were offered. Despite the massive effort, no one was arrested. For many communities, the murder of a police officer is unimaginable. For Bardstown, it was deeply personal. Residents lined the streets as Jason's funeral procession passed. Police officers from across Kentucky came to honor one of their own. Flags flew at half-staff. The community mourned together. But grief wasn't the only emotion people carried. There was fear. If someone could carefully plan the murder of a police officer on a quiet Kentucky highway, what did that mean for everyone else? The questions lingered. Life slowly resumed. Children went back to school. Businesses reopened. The bourbon tours continued. From the outside, Bardstown looked unchanged. But underneath that familiar routine, something had shifted. Who could murder a police officer in such a carefully planned ambush and simply disappear? No one could have imagined that before investigators found those answers, another family would find themselves living a nightmare. One that would change Bardstown once again. Kathy Netherland was a respected member of the Bardstown community. She worked as a special education teacher at Bardstown Elementary School. For years, she dedicated her career to helping children with special needs. Colleagues described her as patient, kind, someone who genuinely cared about every student who entered her classroom. Teaching wasn't simply her profession, it was part of who she was. Outside of school, Kathy was a mother. Her daughter Samantha remained one of the most important people in her life. Like many mothers and daughters, they stayed close. Family members have spoken publicly about the bond they shared and the time they enjoyed spending together. Samantha Netherland was 16 years old. Friends described her as independent, creative, someone who enjoyed being around family. Nobody would have thought that the 16-year-old's life would end so soon. On April 22, 2014, concern began to grow. Coworkers expected Kathy at school. She never arrived. For someone known to be dependable, that was immediately unusual. Attempts were made to contact her. Calls went unanswered. As concern increased, Kathy's father went to the Netherland home on Spring Hill Drive. What he found inside would forever change Bardstown. Kathy and Samantha had both been killed. The scene immediately stunned investigators. Kentucky State Police secured the home. Crime scene technicians began documenting every room. Photographs were taken. Evidence carefully collected. Neighbors watched as patrol cars, crime scene vans, and investigators filled the quiet neighborhood. The news spread quickly. Another violent crime. Another family devastated. Another investigation. From the very beginning, investigators recognized this case presented unique challenges. There was no indication of a random burglary gone wrong. The home contained valuables. There was no widespread ransacking. Kathy and Samantha had been tortured and stabbed to death. Detectives focused on understanding who may have entered the home, why they were there, and what had happened inside. Every room was processed. DNA evidence was collected. Fingerprints were examined. Electronic devices were seized. Investigators worked to establish a timeline for the final hours of Kathy and Samantha's lives. Friends, family, co-workers, and neighbors were interviewed. Every possible lead was explored. For many residents, the Ellis murder had been terrifying, but some had convinced themselves it was an isolated attack directed at a police officer. The Netherland murders challenged that belief. This time, the victims weren't wearing a badge. They weren't working late. They were inside their own home. The realization struck the community hard. If something like this could happen here, to people inside their own house, what did that mean for everyone else? Residents began locking doors they had rarely locked before. Neighborhood conversations changed. Parents became more cautious. People paid closer attention to unfamiliar vehicles. For the second time in less than a year, Bardstown's sense of security had been shaken. Kentucky State Police devoted extensive resources to the case. Crime laboratories analyzed physical evidence, investigators followed tips from across the state. Reward money was offered, search warrants were executed, potential witnesses were interviewed. As months passed, detectives continued working quietly behind the scenes. Like the Ellis investigation, progress was measured not in days, but in years. Public updates remained limited. That silence often frustrated residents, but investigators maintained that protecting the integrity of the case remained their highest priority. As time passed, the unanswered questions began to multiply. Who entered the Netherland home? Why were Kathy and Samantha targeted? Was someone they knew responsible, or had they encountered someone entirely unexpected? Rumors spread quickly. Many people wondered whether the murders could somehow be connected to Officer Jason Ellis. Law enforcement considered numerous possibilities during the investigation. However, investigators emphasized that each case had to be evaluated on its own evidence, and no definitive public conclusion linking the cases has been established. For the families, those distinctions mattered less than the empty spaces left behind. A mother, a daughter, gone. By the spring of 2014, Bardstown had experienced two devastating tragedies in less than a year. One police officer, one mother, one daughter, 3 lives lost. 3 families forever changed. No arrests, no convictions. The community tried to move forward. It had little choice. The Bardstown they had always known felt different. They simply didn't know. It would soon face another tragedy, one that would bring the town national attention unlike anything it had experienced before. Because in just over a year, a young mother named Crystal Rogers would disappear without a trace. Crystal Rogers was 35 years old. More importantly, she was a mother. Those who knew Crystal often describe her first through the lens of her family. She had 5 children who were the center of her world. Friends and relatives have consistently said that no matter what challenges she faced, her children always came first. Like many people, Crystal's life wasn't perfect. She had experienced difficult relationships and the normal ups and downs that come with raising a family. But those closest to her say she was devoted to her children and remained closely connected to her parents and siblings, particularly her father Tommy and her mother Sherry. The Ballards were a close-knit family. They celebrated birthdays together, shared holidays, looked after one another's children. If someone needed help, the family showed up. That closeness would become one of the defining parts of this story, because when Crystal disappeared, they refused to stop looking. By the summer of 2015, Crystal had been in a long-term relationship with Brooks Huck. The two shared a young son together. Brooks was a local businessman who owned rental properties in Nelson County. To many people in Bardstown, they appeared to be another local couple raising a family. But according to family members and later public statements made during the investigation, the relationship had become strained. Crystal's family would later say they believed she had been considering major changes in her life. Those accounts had been discussed publicly by her family over the years, though many details about the relationship remain disputed. What is clear from public record is that by the beginning of July 2015, Crystal's life was about to intersect with one of the largest missing person investigations Kentucky had ever seen. The weekend began like so many others. It was the 4th of July weekend. Across Bardstown, families were grilling outside. Children chased fireworks across backyards. Neighbors gathered with friends. Summer was in full swing. On the evening of July 3rd, Crystal spent time with family. Publicly reported timelines indicate that she attended a family gathering before later leaving with Brooks Huck. This was the last day she was seen alive. Crystal's mother reported her missing on July 5th. According to Brooks Huck's public statements to investigators, the two spent part of the evening of July 3rd together at his family farm. He later told investigators that Crystal went to sleep. When he woke up the following morning, he claimed she was gone. At first, there didn't appear to be immediate panic. Adults sometimes leave after an argument. People occasionally take time away from home. But something about Crystal's disappearance quickly felt different. Her family wasn't hearing from her. Her children weren't hearing from her. Calls went unanswered, messages were left unread. Those who knew Crystal best began asking a simple question: where was she? And for the people closest to her, one answer seemed impossible to believe: that she had simply chosen to walk away. The Ballards knew Crystal. They knew her routines. They knew how often she checked in. Most importantly, they knew she would never willingly disappear from her children without telling anyone. As concern grew, they reported her missing. What began as a welfare concern quickly transformed into something much larger. Investigators started retracing Crystal's final known movements. Friends were interviewed, family members were questioned, phone records were reviewed, and searches began. Every passing hour made one thing increasingly clear: Crystal Rogers hadn't simply lost touch. She had vanished. Then, just 2 days after Crystal was last seen, the investigation took a dramatic turn. On July 7th, her maroon Chevy Impala was discovered abandoned along the Bluegrass Parkway. The location immediately caught investigators' attention. This wasn't an ordinary parking lot or a shopping center. The vehicle had been left on the shoulder of a major roadway. The same Bluegrass Parkway where just over 2 years earlier, Officer Jason Ellis had been ambushed and killed. At first glance, the car appeared largely intact, but investigators soon noticed several unusual details. Crystal's purse, wallet, and personal belongings remained inside. Even more concerning, one of the tires was flat. Public reporting has also noted that the keys were found inside the vehicle. To Crystal's family, none of it made sense. If she had intentionally left, why leave behind nearly everything she would need? The abandoned car transformed the investigation overnight. This was no longer a simple missing persons case. Investigators now faced a far more troubling possibility: that somewhere, Crystal Rogers had become the victim of a crime. As volunteers spread across fields and wooded areas, one man refused to believe the search would end without bringing his daughter home. His name was Tommy Ballard, and before long, his determination would make him the face of Bardstown's search for answers. For Crystal's family, there was never a question of whether they would look for her. The only question was where to begin. Every hour that passed without hearing from Crystal made the situation more urgent. The abandoned car on Bluegrass Parkway had only deepened their fears. To investigators, it was evidence. To her family, it was proof that something was terribly wrong. Crystal had left behind her purse, her wallet, her keys, the everyday items people instinctively reach for before walking away from a vehicle. Her family couldn't imagine a scenario where she would voluntarily leave those things behind. Nor could they imagine her willingly disappearing without contacting her 5 children. The search began almost immediately. At first, it was family, friends, neighbors, people who knew Crystal personally. They searched fence lines, walking slowly through tall grass under the July sun. They looked beneath bridges, along creek beds, inside abandoned buildings. They checked wooded areas where visibility was limited by dense undergrowth. Every place that could possibly hide someone, they searched. Then the community began showing up. One volunteer became 10, 10 became 50. Soon, Hundreds of people were gathering before sunrise with bottles of water, work gloves, hiking boots, and printed maps. Some had never met Crystal. Others only knew her parents. But in Bardstown, that was enough. When one family was hurting, the community responded. Each morning began the same way. Volunteers gathered at a central meeting location. Search coordinators divided large maps into smaller sections. Groups were assigned roads, fields, wooded property, and creek banks. Some volunteers searched on foot. Others rode horses across farmland. ATVs navigated rough terrain, and boats checked nearby bodies of water. The Kentucky State Police coordinated investigative efforts while volunteers focused on covering as much ground as possible. Search dogs were brought in. Helicopters surveyed from above. As each section was completed, another was assigned. It was exhausting work. July in Kentucky is unforgiving. The humidity clings to everything. Temperatures climb quickly. Ticks, thick brush, and uneven ground slowed progress. Yet each morning, the volunteers came back. Many took vacation days from work. Others spent weekends searching instead of being with their own families, because everyone hoped the next hill, the next field, the next tree line might finally bring Crystal home. Tommy Ballard refused to let hope disappear. Those who knew Tommy described him as hardworking, quiet, determined. He wasn't interested in television cameras. He simply wanted to find his daughter. Almost overnight, Tommy became the driving force behind the search effort. Long before volunteers arrived each morning, Tommy was already awake, planning routes, coordinating search areas, speaking with investigators, answering phone calls from people who thought they might have information. His truck became a familiar sight throughout Nelson County. Friends later recalled that Tommy rarely seemed to stop moving. If there was a place left to search, he was going. For Tommy, quitting simply wasn't an option, because fathers don't stop looking for their daughters. As the weeks passed, the disappearance of Crystal Rogers began receiving widespread media coverage. Regional news outlets were soon joined by national programs. Television crews arrived in Bardstown. Satellite trucks parked near search headquarters. Journalists interviewed family members almost daily. For many viewers, Crystal became another missing person story. But for Bardstown, it was far more personal. Residents weren't watching the news from hundreds of miles away. They were living it. The grocery store conversations changed. Church prayer requests changed. People who had once talked about weather or bourbon tourism or high school sports now discussed search locations, possible sightings, rumors, the latest news conference. The disappearance seemed to touch every corner of the community. And with every high-profile investigation, rumors followed. People speculated about what might have happened. Some believed Crystal had left voluntarily. Others insisted she never would have abandoned her kids. Names circulated quietly through town. Conversations happened in restaurants, at gas stations, outside churches. Law enforcement repeatedly reminded the public that rumors could damage an active investigation. They urged anyone with actual information to come forward. But in a town where everyone knew someone, keeping speculation from spreading proved almost impossible. For Crystal's family, the rumors were exhausting. Every new theory brought fresh hope or fresh heartbreak. Every reported sighting had to be checked. Every anonymous tip had to be considered. Most led nowhere. While volunteers continued searching the countryside, detectives focused on reconstructing Crystal's final days. They examined phone records, interviewed friends, reviewed financial activity, executed search warrants, collected forensic evidence. Every decision Crystal had made during those final days was scrutinized. Investigators weren't simply trying to determine where she had gone. They were trying to answer a far more difficult question. What had happened after she was last seen? As the investigation passed, law enforcement began making it clear that they no longer believed this was a missing persons case alone. They believed Crystal Rogers had likely been the victim of foul play. But believing a crime had occurred and proving who committed it were two very different things. Weeks turned into months. The search never truly ended. Even after organized volunteer events became less frequent, Tommy Ballard continued. If someone called with a possible location, he went. If hunters discovered something unusual, he checked. Many people admired his determination. Others quietly wondered how someone could continue carrying so much hope for so long. Tommy always seemed to have the same answer. Until Crystal came home, the search wasn't over. As investigators worked behind the scenes, one name appeared more and more often in public discussion. It belonged to someone Crystal knew well, someone who had been among the last people to see her alive. The investigation was about to become increasingly focused on the people closest to Crystal. Every missing persons investigation begins with the same fundamental question: who saw them last? In Crystal's case, that answer was clear. According to the timeline investigators assembled, one of the last known people to have been with Crystal was her longtime boyfriend, Brooks Hupp. It was a fact that immediately placed him at the center of investigators' attention. That did not mean he had been charged with a crime, nor did it mean investigators had reached any conclusions. It simply meant they needed to understand exactly what happened during Crystal's final hours. As they would in any major investigation, detectives began interviewing those closest to her: friends, family members, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who may have spoken with Crystal in the days before she disappeared. According to Brooks's public statements to investigators, he and Crystal had spent part of the evening together at his family's farm. He said they watched television. He told investigators Crystal eventually fell asleep. When he woke up the next morning, he claimed she was gone. It was an account investigators documented carefully. They compared his timeline against phone records, witness statements, digital evidence, and vehicle movements. As is common in major investigations, detectives worked to determine whether every part of the timeline could be independently verified. That process would take months, and eventually, years. As investigators gathered information, they took another significant step. Search warrants were executed at multiple properties connected to the investigation. Crime scene technicians carefully photographed every room, collected potential evidence, documented vehicles, and removed items for forensic testing. Unlike television dramas, search warrants rarely produce immediate answers. Instead, they generate enormous amounts of evidence: computers, cell phones, documents, DNA samples. Each item must be cataloged, processed, and analyzed. Some results return within days. Others can take months. Investigators knew this would not be a quick investigation. One location became especially important: the Huck family farm. It had been one of the last confirmed locations where Crystal was known to have been. Investigators returned repeatedly. Using specialized equipment, they searched fields, outbuildings, wooded areas. Excavation equipment was eventually brought in to examine sections of the property. Each search generated public attention. Helicopters hovered overhead, television cameras gathered outside property lines, and residents slowed their cars as they passed. Everyone wondered the same thing. Had investigators finally found something? Each new search reignited hope for Crystal's family. Each time investigators packed up without announcing a breakthrough, that hope faded once again. As months passed, the pressure on investigators continued to grow. Crystal's disappearance had become national news. Programs across the country began covering the case. Despite the growing attention, many of the most important details remained known only to investigators. That silence frustrated the public. But experienced detectives often protect information for a reason. Certain facts, details known only to investigators, can help determine whether a confession is genuine or whether a witness truly has firsthand knowledge. The public wanted answers immediately, but investigators understood that revealing too much too soon could jeopardize the case forever. Throughout the investigation, Crystal's family continued speaking publicly. Her parents, Sherry and Tommy Ballard, gave interviews pleading for information. Again and again, they repeated the same message. Someone knows what happened. Someone has stayed silent. Please come forward. Time can make witnesses forget, but publicity can sometimes encourage someone to finally speak. As the investigation stretched into its second year, Bardstown itself began to change. People found themselves choosing words carefully. Some conversations stopped altogether when strangers entered the room. Rumors spread quickly. Friendships became strained. Families disagreed about what they believed had happened. Some trusted the investigation completely. Others questioned why no arrest had been made. One thing nearly everyone agreed on: Crystal Rogers had not simply disappeared. Someone knew more than they were saying. The challenge was proving it. Behind the scenes, detectives continued assembling their case. Thousands of pages of reports slowly filled investigative files. Major criminal investigations often move slowly, not because investigators aren't working, but because every fact must be verified, every statement corroborated, every piece of evidence capable of surviving scrutiny in court. Detectives weren't simply trying to solve a mystery. They were trying to build a case that would withstand a jury. If they moved too quickly, they risked losing the opportunity for justice altogether. As the investigation quietly advanced, Tommy Ballard had become the heart of the search. Few people could have imagined that just over a year after Crystal disappeared, Bardstown would lose him too. If Crystal Rogers was the heart of this investigation, Tommy Ballard became its soul. Long before television cameras arrived in Bardstown, before reporters filled the courthouse lawn, before national news programs began telling Crystal's story, Tommy was simply Dad. He wasn't interested in interviews or headlines or becoming the public face of a national story. He was a father. And like so many fathers, his greatest sense of purpose came from protecting his children. Family members have described Tommy as dependable, hardworking, the kind of man who would quietly help someone without expecting anything in return. He loved hunting. He loved the outdoors. He loved spending time with his family. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't someone used to cameras following him. But after Crystal disappeared, everything changed. The search became more than an effort to find Crystal. It became Tommy's life. As weeks became months, organized searches naturally became smaller. That's often what happens in missing persons investigations. Life slowly pulls volunteers back towards jobs, school, and family responsibilities. But Tommy never stopped. If only 3 people showed up, they searched. If no one came, Tommy searched anyway. Many people who joined those efforts have spoken publicly about Tommy's determination. No matter how difficult the day became, he remained focused. Friends said he refused to believe the search was over, because to Tommy, it wasn't, not until Crystal came home. Many parents watching from home saw themselves in him. What would they do if one of their children disappeared? Most arrived at the same answer: exactly what Tommy was doing. Never stop looking. As the investigation continued, public attention remained fixed on Bardstown. Every time investigators searched a new location, Tommy allowed himself a little hope. Maybe this would be the day. Maybe someone had finally talked. Maybe Crystal would finally come home. But each search ended the same way, without answers. The emotional toll became almost impossible to imagine. Hope, followed by disappointment, again and again and again. Yet Tommy never allowed himself to quit. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, everything changed again. It was November 19th, 2016. Tommy had spent the day doing something he genuinely enjoyed. He was hunting with his 12-year-old grandson on family property in Nelson County. It should have been an ordinary afternoon. A grandfather teaching his grandson, sharing stories, creating memories, the kind of day families treasure. Instead, it became another tragedy. According to investigators, Tommy was walking with his grandson when a single gunshot rang out. Tommy collapsed. His grandson immediately ran for help. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but Tommy Ballard died at the scene. He was 54 years old. The news spread through Bardstown with stunning speed. People couldn't believe it. The man who had spent more than a year searching for his missing daughter was now gone himself. Investigators immediately began examining every possibility. Could this have been a tragic hunting accident, or had someone intentionally targeted Tommy? Kentucky State Police investigated extensively. After examining the evidence, they publicly stated they did not believe Tommy's death was an accident. Instead, they investigated it as a homicide. For Crystal's family, the grief became almost unbearable. First, Crystal disappeared. Now Tommy was gone. Within 16 months, their family had been devastated twice. Bardstown mourned once again. Churches filled with prayers, neighbors gathered, law enforcement officers returned. This time, not for a fellow officer, but for the father who had become the face of the search for justice. Many people wondered, how much heartbreak could one town endure? Officer Jason Ellis, Kathy and Samantha Netherland, Crystal Rogers, now Tommy Ballard. 4 separate investigations, 4 families forever changed. 4 cases with no answers. The questions grew louder, and so did the fear. By late 2016, something had fundamentally changed inside Bardstown. Residents still smiled at one another downtown. The bourbon industry continued welcoming visitors. Life appeared normal, but conversations had changed. Parents became more cautious, doors were locked more often. People thought twice before dismissing strange behavior. A quiet question lingered over the community. Was this all connected? Or was Bardstown experiencing an unimaginable series of unrelated tragedies? Investigators couldn't answer that question. Not yet. But one thing had become painfully clear. The search for Crystal Rogers was no longer only about finding a missing mother. It had become part of something much larger, something that would eventually draw the attention of federal investigators and the national media. For years, Bardstown waited. The television trucks that had once lined the streets disappeared. Satellite dishes folded away. Reporters who had spent weeks broadcasting from courthouse lawns moved on to the next breaking story. National headlines became less frequent. The daily updates slowed. Search parties grew smaller. Main Street looked much the way it always had. To someone passing through, Bardstown seemed untouched. But for the families, time had stood still. Every birthday arrived with an empty chair. Every holiday carried another reminder of who wasn't there. Crystal Rogers was still missing. Officer Jason Ellis's killer had not been identified. Who had killed the Netherlands? Tommy Ballard's murder remained unsolved. For the Ballard family, there was no moving on. There was only moving forward. One day at a time, always hoping that today might finally be the day the phone rang with answers. While public attention faded, the investigation never truly stopped. Contrary to what many people believe, major investigations don't simply sit untouched once the cameras leave. In many ways, the most important work begins after the headlines disappear. Boxes filled with evidence occupied shelves inside police evidence rooms. Every interview transcript, search warrant, forensic report was preserved. Investigators returned to those files repeatedly, reading them with fresh perspective, looking for inconsistencies. Small details that may not have seemed important years earlier were looked at again. Digital evidence was re-examined as technology improved. Witnesses were re-interviewed, sometimes multiple times. Because investigators know something the public often doesn't. People remember things over time. Someone who once believed a detail wasn't important may suddenly realize it matters. Someone who remained silent out of fear may eventually feel safe enough to speak. Relationships change, friendships end, families grow apart. The passage of time can slowly remove the very barriers that once kept people silent. For detectives, patience isn't giving up. It's another investigative tool. Investigators were not trying to just make an arrest. They were trying to secure a conviction, and those are two very different goals. An arrest can happen in a single afternoon, but a conviction requires evidence that can withstand months or even years of scrutiny inside a courtroom. Detectives understood that if they moved too quickly, they might never get another opportunity. They had one chance, and they intended to get it right. For the public, however, that progress was invisible. They wanted updates, they wanted arrests, and they wanted answers. Instead, months often passed without a single press conference. Online speculation filled the silence. Investigators repeatedly cautioned the public against confusing speculation with evidence. Then, after years of investigation, something changed. Law enforcement announced new investigative activity. Search warrants were executed at multiple locations connected to the case. Evidence was collected. Items were removed for additional forensic testing. Each announcement reignited hope. For Crystal's family, every search meant investigators still believed answers could be found. Every press conference meant the investigation remained active. For the first time in years, it felt as though the silence surrounding the case had begun to break. After years of investigation by the Kentucky State Police, the FBI, and prosecutors, the case finally reached a courtroom. One of the central figures in the investigation, Brooks Huck, Crystal's longtime boyfriend and the father of one of her children, was tried in connection with her disappearance and death. After hearing the evidence presented at trial, the jury found Brooks guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. Another defendant, Stephen Lawson, a friend of Brooks, was also convicted for his role in the case and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The why is unknown. For Crystal's family, the verdicts represented a significant step towards justice. After years of uncertainty, someone had finally been held accountable in a court of law. But even with those convictions, one heartbreaking question remained unanswered. Where is Crystal Rogers? Her family still cannot visit a gravesite. They still cannot lay her to rest. They still don't know exactly where she is. For many families of missing victims, that absence becomes its own kind of sentence. Justice in a courtroom can provide accountability, but it cannot replace a chance to bring someone home. The convictions answered some of the questions that had haunted Bardstown for years, but they didn't answer all of them. Officer Jason Ellis's murder remains unsolved. Tommy Ballard's murder remains unsolved. The murders of Kathy and Samantha Netherland remain unsolved. And Crystal Rogers has still not been found. For Bardstown, the search for complete answers isn't over. Today, if you visit Bardstown, Kentucky, you'll probably understand why so many people fell in love with it. You'll find brick sidewalks lined with local shops, historic churches whose bells still ring every Sunday morning, families enjoying dinner together on the square, visitors laughing as they tour bourbon distilleries that have stood for generations, neighbors stopping to talk on Main Street. On the surface, Bardstown is exactly what it has always been, one of America's most beautiful small towns. A place built on tradition, history, and community. For many visitors, that's all they'll ever see. But for the people who call Bardstown home, there's another map, one you can't find in a travel brochure. A stretch of highway where Officer Jason Ellis never made it home to his family. A quiet house where Kathy and Samantha Netherland spent what should have been another ordinary evening together. A lonely shoulder along the Bluegrass Parkway where Crystal Rogers' car was discovered, raising questions that would haunt a community for years. Fields, creeks, and wooded hillsides where volunteers searched day after day, refusing to give up hope. And a hunting property where Tommy Ballard, a father who simply refused to stop looking for his daughter, lost his own life. Those places aren't marked with signs. There are no monuments telling visitors what happened there. But the people of Bardstown remember, because tragedy has a way of becoming part of the landscape. Not the kind you can photograph, but the kind you carry with you. When people outside Kentucky hear the name Bardstown, they often think about the mysteries, the headlines, the documentaries, the unanswered questions. But after spending time there, I think they're remembering the wrong thing. This isn't just the story of crimes. It's the story of a town. A police officer who believed in serving his community. A teacher who dedicated her life to helping children. A daughter spending time with her mother. A young mother whose children are still growing up without her. Who refused to stop searching. And a community that kept showing up for one another, even when it seemed like the answers might never come. Because that's what small towns do. When tragedy arrives, they grieve together. They search together. They remember together. And somehow, they keep moving forward. Maybe that's the real story of Bardstown. Not that so many terrible things happened, but that despite everything, people still call it home. The bourbon still ages in oak barrels, the church bells still ring, children still grow up riding bicycles through neighborhoods. Neighbors still wave as they pass each other on quiet streets. Life continues, not because anyone has forgotten, but because communities learn how to carry grief while continuing to live. At the beginning of this episode, I told you Bardstown was known as one of the most beautiful small towns in America. After everything we've talked about today, I think that's still true. Not because tragedy never found it, but because the people who live there refuse to let tragedy become the only thing that defines them. I'm Alexa, and this has been Hometown Confidential. Because before America knew Bardstown for its mysteries, it was simply home. And for thousands of people, it still is. Because every small town has a story.